Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you can join us all. Jamie, are you there?
I am.
Good afternoon. I'm Guillermo Gomez, Program Director of the Urban Design Forum, tuning in from Ridgewood, Queens.
I'm Jamie Weisberg. I'm a Senior Campaign Analyst at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and I'm tuning in from Jackson Heights, Queens.
Queens Pride today. Well, it's really nice to be here with you, Jamie, and our members and our friends as we lead our second event of our discussion series, Power After the Pandemic, and hear from our esteemed speakers coming up today. For those of you who are new to the forum, we are an independent membership organization that debates the critical issues facing our city. Our fellows are designers, developers, public officials, and advocates eager to shape a better future for all New Yorkers. And generally in normal times, we like to kind of squeeze around a table, debate, share ideas of what our city could be. We're incredibly excited to partner with ANHD to bridge our constituencies in community development, neighborhood advocacy, urban design, and public policy to define a vision for a post-pandemic city.
Hi, and then for those of you who are new to ANHD, we work to build community power and to win affordable housing and thriving, equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. ANHD has been around for more than 40 years. We represent over 80 neighborhood-based and citywide not-for-profit organizations who develop, preserve, and manage affordable housing, push for tenant rights, support small businesses, advocate for responsible banking, and work to preserve industrial space and quality jobs. We believe that racial justice is housing justice, is economic justice. We're also so grateful to partner with UDF for this series and excited to bring you all the important and powerful conversations alongside them.
So of course, the pandemic isn't over yet, and we're still grappling with how to remain healthy in our schools, our workplaces, and the economic consequences on New York's Black and brown neighborhoods, immigrant communities, and cultural producers are devastating. And there are some enormous challenges still coming, including of course, a federal election and a budget crisis. But it's important to be hopeful. So through this series, we're hoping to find inspiration, hear from community development, urban design, and public policy leaders who have bright ideas to make sure we never get here again. We launched our series earlier this month with a fireside chat between ANHD's Executive Director, Barika Williams, and a scholar, Marissa Baradaran, really unpacking the inherited racist systems in our country's banking policy and how our current economic system is neither equitable nor democratic. So as we continue our series, we'll prompt all our speakers, what's the one big transformational change you'd like to see emerge from the crisis? In the coming months, we'll continue to organize discussions with leaders in finance, housing, transportation, and economic development. We're also hoping to hear from you and recreate that community that has really been frayed these past couple of months. We invite you to stick around for an extra half hour after our event is over, share your thoughts in small breakout groups, which we're calling Power Lunch. We'll provide a Zoom link toward the end of the event and kind of throughout today's discussion as well. So with that, I'll hand things off to you, Jamie, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. I'm really excited for this panel. We have three distinguished panelists here. We have Kerry McLean, Vice President of Community Development at WHEDco, based in the Bronx and a member of ANHD. She directs neighborhood planning, commercial revitalization, and creative place-affirming initiatives, and spearheaded the launch of the Bronx Music Heritage Center. We have Paulina Gonzalez-Brito, the Executive Director of the California Reinvestment Coalition, which is a statewide coalition fighting for racial and economic justice in California. Under her leadership, CRC has expanded its work to directly challenge systemic and structural racism within the US financial system. And our very own New York State Senator, James Sanders Jr., within his fourth term representing Southeast Queens. He is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Banks and heads the Senate Task Force on Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises. After a brief intro to set the stage that I will give, each panelist will give introductory remarks, followed by a moderated discussion and questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A box as they come to you. So as we know, the US is in a global health pandemic and economic crisis right now. It has claimed the lives of over 215,000 people nationwide and nearly 24,000 here in New York City. Within those statistics, Black and brown communities have suffered higher rates of illness, death, and economic hardship. COVID knows nothing of race, income, ethnicity, but a history of segregation, discrimination, and racist policies means the impact has been inequitable across housing, education, access to healthcare and jobs, and as the topic of this panel, banks and financial institutions. And the history of discrimination and neglect in low-income communities and communities of color runs deep. Just some examples in our more recent history leading up to the civil rights laws of the 60s and 70s. exclusion of Blacks and Latinos from government benefits, such as the GI Bill, education, housing guarantees, labor rights, new deal jobs, disinvestment of blockbusting, predatory practices, urban renewal plans, and more. One area that ANHD and the panelists here focus a lot on is the Community Reinvestment Act, passed in 1977. It was the last of a series of civil rights laws designed to address acts of discrimination, along with the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. It's a simple law stating that banks have an obligation to help meet the credit needs of the local communities in which they're chartered. And we know it is anything but simple, but the premise is simple. And this should mean bank branches with affordable, accessible banking products, affordable mortgages to buy or stay in a home, small business loans and supports, financing for affordable housing, economic development, community services, investments in credit unions, CDFIs, and more. Over the past 4 years, the Trump administration has been taking steps to weaken the CRA and roll back bank regulations that harm communities of color and will hinder COVID recovery. We and others are doing all we can to combat these harmful policies and advocate for a stronger CRA. Meanwhile, redlining, disinvestment, exploitation persist and persisted long before this administration. They appear in the form of predatory high-cost lending that cause harm and fuel displacement, banking deserts, overdrafts, payday lending, non-bank lenders and products, and outright discrimination that perpetuate redlining. And it's not an accident, it didn't just happen. Systems are by design, and the financial systems we have are often racist and biased against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I encourage you to go back and listen to our conversation with Mercer Baradaran and our director, Barika Williams, about the racism and inequities in our banking and financial system. These deregulation and attacks on civil rights protections, coupled with the disparate impact of the COVID pandemic and inequitable distribution of relief, are emblematic of and exacerbating these ongoing inequalities. ANHD has published numerous pieces on the intersection of overcrowding, access to hospitals, communities of color, concentrations of service workers, and COVID cases. A recent analysis of the Paycheck Protection Program also shows how fewer of these loans were concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities. We are here today to explore a broad range of bold approaches to community finance that will foster an equitable recovery. I'm excited to have experts who can speak to on-the-ground needs in New York City and the Bronx, state solutions from our legislature, and solutions taking place across the country. So with that, I will stop talking and lead us into Kerry McLean from WHEDco. So please, Kerry, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can all hear me. Thank you to ANHD and UDF for inviting me to speak a little bit today about some of the challenges that we've been confronting here in the Bronx in this time around community finance. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you can all see that. I'm sure somebody will let me know if you can all see that. So just building off of what Jamie just spoke about, this is the Bronx's redlining map. So some of the inequities and disparities, the disinvestment that was, federally sanctioned resulted in what you're looking at here, which is that many parts of the Bronx, most of the Bronx with the exception of a few areas, were deemed unworthy of investment by the federal government. So those are the areas that you see in red and the areas that you see in yellow. So there are only a few places where you see green for investment worthy. And most of those places that were deemed not worthy of investment were Black and brown communities where we live and we work today. And the communities where we live and work are continuing to try to climb out of this legacy of disinvestment that has persisted. So what that has resulted in from this map that you're looking at now is that there continues to be an absence of bank branches in communities of color across the city, but certainly in the Bronx. In fact, the Bronx has, and this is the Bronx here on this map, the Bronx has among the highest share of unbanked and underbanked households in the country and in New York City. As you can see in the areas that are in white, there are fewer than 1 bank branches per 10,000 residents in those areas, which, as you can tell, is a majority of the places in the Bronx. We have 2.5 million people here, rather 1.5 million people. And, it's just unheard of, and just such a disadvantage for community members when they do not have access to affordable financial services here. Business owners that we work with here at WHEDco, where we are working on just giving access here in the South Bronx, where we work to community members to have all that they need in their neighborhoods to thrive, including economic opportunity. We work with small businesses who, even if they have a bank account, have a hard time getting access to capital that they need in order to advance and grow their businesses. This is just in regular times before COVID. Additionally, again, with the lack of bank branches, community members, don't have safe, convenient places in their own neighborhoods where they can save, which is a crucial way to stabilize any family and to even begin to build wealth. As a nonprofit, we also build affordable housing. So it's crucial for us to be able to access affordable financial tools to be able to, continue that legacy of building safely, building affordably for community members who need it. So it is just so critical, the need for accessing financial services in our neighborhoods. And as you can tell again from this map, that has been a difficult proposition for us to gain here. So since COVID, this has all been exacerbated even further. As you can tell from these maps, these NHD maps, in fact, our neighborhoods shown here in red on this left side have had the highest number of positive cases across New York City. On the map on the right, you will see that we also have some of the highest rates of service workers. So those are frontline workers, healthcare workers, delivery persons who, are essential workers who have had to go to work during this time of COVID. And you can tell that we have been disproportionately, affected during this time. In this next map, on the left, you will see that here in the Bronx, we also have a very high share of rent-burdened households across the borough. And again, just during COVID, that has been further exacerbated. And the map here on the right shows that we are predominantly a borough of people of color. So as we look again at the systemic issues of financial exclusion that have just pervaded our communities, the COVID crisis certainly has made things even more acute and worse, really, for those who live, work, and do business here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the neighborhoods where we work, where they're one of the hardest hit neighborhoods actually here, over here in the West Bronx, where in the midst of all of this, we found out that a bank, Amalgamated Bank, would be closing its doors. So we mobilized quickly with a collaborative that we're a part of called the Jerome Avenue Revitalization Collaborative, mobilized community members with the community board to protest this bank closing at a time when small businesses and community members needed the most access to service, when they had invested in the bank over 12 years really, in a banking development district. The bank was now abandoning the community. So we mobilized quickly with community members to hold a press conference, as well as to, which got the attention of Amalgamated. And Amalgamated, we ended up meeting with the CEO and his team, and they committed to continuing to invest in the neighborhood. And we are in conversations with them now to not only look at some of kind of like the lower hanging fruit things that can be done, like financial education, like providing transition period of time where staff from the bank are actually located in a community center in the community to help people transition their account services, but to also go beyond that to what their CRA plan is and coming up with a specific CRA plan for this neighborhood, as well as across the city where the bank is actually closing 6 other branches. So these are some of the ways in which we're confronting the community finance issues in the Bronx. I would just leave you with a few things that we have learned, which is, certainly working in collaborative is crucial. We immediately called ANHD once we found out about this bank closure. So mobilizing community, bringing in the experts, going public, and certainly going big in terms of asking these financial institutions to really reinvest in Black and Brown communities that have invested in them. So one question I would ask of all of you, it's a challenge, I think, to really kind of land the Community Reinvestment Act in our communities. So one question is, what ideas do you have for engaging community members around financial access and inclusion in your community? So if you can just take a moment throughout this presentation, just leave your comments in the chat, and we will certainly discuss those. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. That was fantastic, and it really sets the stage for our next speaker, who is going to talk about what's happening across the country. We have Paulina Gonzalez-Brito from the California Reinvestment Coalition. And I know when you say to reach out to the experts, I often reach out to them. So I'm really excited to have Paulina here. I'm going to go off camera and start the timer.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks for inviting me to join you all this morning. And thanks, Kerry, for that presentation. I would like to start today by talking about this health and economic crisis that we're currently in, but really acknowledge that it's not the first one. And most importantly, talk about how we got here, and really talk about how it's rooted in white supremacy, this cycle that we're in of crisis after crisis, and how we must be actively anti-racist in promoting and creating new systems and policies, and really talk about the original sins of this country rooted in slavery, colonization, and genocide. And that when we think about the systems that have been created in this country, that their DNA of those systems have been rooted in those original sins. And that includes the financial system that we're talking about today. And so often when I think about crises, this crisis in particular, but really all the crises that we've been faced in as people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, and the foreclosure crisis. But as we think about COVID, we often talk about all being in the same boat. But actually, some of us are on that boat without life vests. Some of us have gone overboard. Some of us are dog paddling, and some of us are drowning in the water. And so I know, you just saw some slides from Kerry illustrating this. In California, we're seeing the same thing. We released a report a few weeks ago. I'll put it in the chat in a bit. And when we talk about the conditions that lead to a disproportionate impact of COVID on Latinx and Black Californians in this case, or across the country, and the disproportionate impact both in infection and mortality, that we really need to talk about this as not accidental, but actually intentional. And so when we talk about essential workers and the fact that BIPOC workers are the majority of essential workers, I think about, are we essential or are we sacrificial when I look at numbers like this? Why is it that 45% of white workers can work from home remotely, but only 25% of Latinx workers can work from home remotely, or 35% of Black workers can work from home remotely? Or why is it that between February and April, 1 in 3 Latina non-citizen workers lost their jobs? The reality is that we have less paid sick leave, or we have less savings, and that this is a long history of institutionalized racism. It's in the DNA of our economy, it's in the DNA of our financial system, and that's what I'd really like to focus on today. And I can look at, I'd like to talk a little bit about that in the context of the relief around COVID. So we talk about the HEROES Act and the CARES Act. I learned recently that there's there's like a team of people that come up with these names in DC, or the PPP loan program, for instance, right? I think about that in the context that we're living in right now, where there's a reckoning in this country around racism and the long history of that that I talked about in terms of the original sins of this country. And I think about the bank CEOs who are saying Black Lives Matter, or what we learned just a few weeks ago in terms of a memo that a bank CEO released that says that there's just a limited pool of Black talent to recruit from, or when I go to an event with bankers and I sit at a table and bankers tell me, well, you know, there's just not enough qualified Latinos to lend to, home loans to, right? Or the fact that a bank has a concierge service for PPP loans for their existing clients, but there's no branches in East Oakland. I live in Oakland, I work in the Bay Area. Where we're seen, Black and brown people are seen as riskier or too risky. But the reality is we've been excluded intentionally from building wealth over the history of this country. And this sets us up for economic crisis after economic crisis, and then it also sets us up to be disproportionately impacted by a crisis like COVID. We've all heard the stories. Jamie touched on this in the very beginning around small businesses. So 41% of Black-owned small businesses closed between February and April of this year, compared to 17% of white-owned small businesses. And when we looked at the demographic data of PPP loans, and of course that data was not collected, but there were some self-reported, 2% of PPP loans went to Black-owned small businesses, 6% went to Latino-owned. We're looking at a potential massive wealth transfer like we saw in the foreclosure crisis, now happening potentially in small businesses. So when I think about the COVID relief that is being presented to Americans, I look at an assumption of access and opportunity. And that assumption of access and opportunity is rooted in white supremacy. We did a report on COVID relief offered by banks, and we surveyed banks in California, and this includes all the big banks that we all know. And the survey respondents often talked about help for consumers and customers and small businesses that are harmed by COVID. And what we found is there was an assumption of access, right? So, for instance, you know, you could ask for relief for customers, so they could ask for release for fee waivers for, let's say, overdraft fees, non-sufficient fund fees, ATM fees. You could, you know, mortgage forbearance was being offered for homeowners up to 6 months, but we heard a lot of, well, we're first offering for 90 days and then you can ask for 6 months on top of that. And in some cases, we found that there were lump sum payments inconsistent with FHA policy. What this means is that you have to be able to then navigate the system. You have to be able to advocate for yourself. And we know that if you're wealthier, often white, and you have generations of access to a system and know how to navigate that system, you're more likely to be able to access that relief. And so that's what I mean. And what we know, we need to be able to say, is a system rooted in white supremacy. That's the DNA of the system. And so when, you know, you saw a map similar to this is Oakland, the redlining map. Kerry showed a similar one. We need to be able to say, when we look at the racial wealth gap, right, when we look at the disproportionate impact of COVID on our communities, that this is not accidental, it is intentional. And when we say it is intentional, it's intentional because of the government mandated redlining. When we look at this redlining map, right, there was an intentional and mandated government mandated redlining. So when banks were actually forbidden to make loans to Black Americans, home loans to Black Americans, right? And then that was instituted and institutionalized into the banking system. Veterans who returned from World War II, Black veterans who returned from World War II, were not able to take out more VA mortgages, right? So this is the structural racism that is embedded into the system now, that has prevented us from building that intergenerational wealth while white Americans have built theirs. And so what does it look like to reimagine systems in the time of COVID, at a time when we're reckoning with racism in this country and challenging systems of policing and state violence against Black people, and when militias are being emboldened across the country? That's the question we need to be asking ourselves. I don't have all the answers. I think that's the question for us to come up with collectively. But I think it starts with being able to say the words white supremacy, being able to say that that's in the DNA of the system, of the financial system. And I think we need to, one, clean up the house, right? So we have, you know, CRA as a tool. We need to defend a very important law that was put in place to undo the redlining that is and the discrimination within the financial system. We need to look at the assumptions of opportunity that are in the relief packages. And so, you know, like all, you know, the forms of relief should be automatic and universal versus, you know, expecting people to have to be able to, you know, go in and navigate a system that is not set up to serve us. You know, there's other types of, there should be, for instance, you know, grants for small businesses directly targeting, you know, Black-owned small businesses versus loans. That's what we're hearing from our members in California. And then we need to look at new systems. Do we need to be building alternative systems of capital for our communities? And, you know, we've been looking at public banks here in California. I know New York has a really important campaign around that. ACRE has a Cancel Wall Street campaign. Cities and states pay huge amounts to Wall Street on interest rates for bonds. And the Federal Reserve, what they're saying is the Federal Reserve should put out zero interest loans to the public sector, and billions of dollars could be saved and then reinvested back into communities. So what are those types of ideas that actually move us away from a system that is embedded in white supremacy and then allows us to rethink how we can actually use that money to actually support the communities that have been extracted from and excluded. Thank you so much. And you can reach me at this email here.
Thank you, Paulina. That was amazing. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but that means we have a lot more to discuss because the conversation is not over. So please stay. That was great. And I think you're right. And I know you're right. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to bring on Senator Sanders to speak for a brief intro, and then we're going to go into some dialogue and hopefully delve into more of the things that Paulina and Kerry and the Senator say. The Senator could put on your camera.
Okay, we're getting there. I got one. Now, if I figure out.
We hear you.
All right. Okay. It's saying that the host has stopped my video. Okay. All right.
Oh, there we go.
All right. They can't keep us apart. Well, it's good to see you again, Jamie. We seems like we're a tag team and we're doing this a lot.
Absolutely.
And this is good. It's good to know, you know, I to be honest, I was just sitting here learning from the other speakers and enjoying it so much that I could have just yielded my time and it would have been useful. It's just encouraging to know that there are some really fantastic people out there like the speakers previous to me. I will try not to embarrass us too much, but I will speak to you. I agree with everyone that we are in a racial capitalist system with all the joys and pains that it brings. Whether these pains are white supremacy, misogyny, we could just go on and we would spend all of our time just on that. I'm wearing 3 hats today. I'm your senator of a local district. I'm the chair of banking for New York State, but I'm also the chair of the Senate Task Force on MWBE. So I've been able to keep up with all of these things, sadly. Now, part of my district, speaking, all politics is local, so part of my district, which is the 10th senatorial district in Southeast Queens, the area around Kennedy Airport. think of Kennedy Airport. There's people around there, my friends. That's my neighborhood. We have the second, during the height of the COVID-19 crisis in New York State, my district had the unenviable position of having the second highest amount of deaths in New York City at that point, which was the second highest in New York State, and at that point, the second highest in the nation. And even now, part of my district is locked down. We're going back into a type of lockdown because the illness is spreading, and so we've never come out of this totally, and now we're back in it, and we're having all kinds of problems. Now, the state Senate, of course, is getting into the action and trying to help find remedies under these conditions. I would have moved faster, but then again, there I go thinking. And including in those efforts, I did a banking committee hearing just yesterday that Ms. Weisberg was kind enough to be on. We have in New York State, under me as chair of banking, we were about to do a new focus on CRA. We were about to really go into what does this mean in New York State, and how come just about every bank gets a satisfactory on CRA when that's just not the case on the ground. It's just, no, it's unsatisfactory. And to be unsatisfactory in New York, you had to really be out of compliance. You really had to work hard to be unsatisfactory, since the majority of banks were satisfactory. Sadly, we have to remember that COVID stopped us, and that I'm in charge of state banks, state chartered banks, meaning your larger coast to coast behemoths are not part of my bailiwick. So I really have to deal with state banks, and that gives a real problem there, because then it means that the state banks are able to say, hey, if you're having a higher standard than the federal, you're making us unable to compete. Why should bank people come to us when they have easier time with the federal banks? So it is a real balancing act that has to be done. Some of the things that we're doing currently, of course, we're fighting home lien sales. There's liens on people's homes if they don't pay a certain amount of their taxes. And we're discovering that the banks are getting involved directly, not simply the beneficiaries one way or another, but they are buying some of the liens and giving people an offer that they can't refuse, an offer of you owe $6,000, but you have to pay us $18,000 or we're taking your house. Now, all of these things, we're looking to see what can we do here. All is not lost, however. Even before COVID-19, some amazing people in New York State have been pushing a tool called public banks. And I am blessed to have the legislation at the Senate level to create a public bank and to authorize New York State to create public banks, or to allow public banks, and then B, for New York State to create a public bank itself. And I'm putting the final touches on what does that mean, New York State creating a public bank, learning from the best lessons from all of the people who have been involved in this for years. If you see anything good there, it's because they have taught me these things and told me. The few things that I've added to it are dwarf compared to the incredible work that people have done. But we're not just waiting for that either. There in New York State, there's something called business development districts. And that means the Department of Financial Services here has been trying to lure banks to open up in unbanked communities by putting up a certain amount of state monies that we would put into the to these banks if they come in these areas. We are fighting, I am fighting to ensure that credit unions and perhaps CDFIs and other financial instruments can use this money if they open up in these areas and serve these people. The banking community doesn't exactly see it as I see it, but that's all right. They have a right. I am also the champion of, in New York State, of the stock transfer tax, a tax that would raise $16 billion. New York State has a hole, a deficit where we're roughly $16 billion in the hole and growing. And my stock transfer tax, meaning when stocks are traded at the higher volume, there's so many stocks being traded that even if you gave a 2.5 cents tax on stocks that are less than $500 and a nickel tax on stocks that are over $500, you would actually raise $16 billion a year, which would get us out of the hole, and the 1%, the truly wealthy, they wouldn't even feel it. So we are battling for that. So I'm the champion of that here too, as other people have other ideas of how we can encourage our richer neighbors to participate in all of the sacrifice that the working people are doing. Yes, I agree with our speaker. We call them essential today, but they look like sacrificial to me. If they're essential, then pay them as such. Well, there I go thinking again. So the 3 bills that I would be most known for, God willing, when we succeed, are stock transfer, public banking, and last but never least, reparations. Yes, New York State needs to look at it. So having said those things and having seen the kind face of Jamie alerting me that she wants to get to the conversation, I will stop there.
Thank you, Senator. That was fantastic. I just want to give a quick shout out to our colleagues at New Economy Project who have taken the lead on the public banking in New York City, and we're really excited to have that here in the bill that you have for the framework for it. So I just wanted to say that. So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to come on. I'm going to ask a few questions that I have here, and then I know that I will hear about some questions. Yeah, we're also seeing some questions from the audience, so we'll do a bit of both. So, oops, Senator, come back.
I'm here. I'm just
don't leave. So no worries. I'm gonna look back at my notes as well. So
no, I had to make sure
something, Paulina, that you said really struck me. So I'm gonna say it here, and hopefully you'll be able to elaborate on it a little bit more as we go into these discussions. Just this idea of an assumption of opportunity. You said it a few times. My first question to you all is what's working and what's not. But I just want to lift that up because it's something that I've struggled with as well, right? I think you saw it in your report, and we've talked to banks about this too. You have to call up to get help. You have to call, and there's this assumption that if you just make that call, if you just go to the bank, if you just do this, you will have the same opportunity as everybody else. But the structural inequalities that you're raising up, that everybody is here. So anyway, I just want to lift up that framework and ask you, when you think about what's working and what's not, if you could expand a little bit more on that. And then the question to everybody is, what's working, what's not, from banks and financial institutions?
Thanks, Jamie, for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about the structural issues, but I just, I think about, internet, for example, right? Or even having to, work, 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs. And, people right now even having trouble getting unemployment and having to wait so long to be able to do that. The same is what we heard for banking relief. But there's an assumption that people have internet, right? If you lose your job, you may lose internet, or you may not have internet at all. In some rural parts of California, people don't have internet access. And so I think that kind of assumption is embedded in a system that sets a standard around access, and it's really a standard around whiteness and a standard around opportunity and access that assumes that everybody has a certain level of access that we just don't, and that our communities don't often. And so that means that you can't access that relief, or even around language, right? If you're a limited English proficiency speaker, you know, and have to access that system, I think about my dad often in these cases, you know, it's just not something that works for everybody. But I'll stop there and see if others want to add to that.
Super helpful, thank you. Kerry, you're a senator, would you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we kept hearing from Amalgamated, for example, it's a business decision and we're going to transition everybody to online because that's what we're going to do. And we're like, our communities are not online. Digital access is an issue, not only the tool to actually use to get online, but the internet, you know, connection, as well as the knowledge of, you know, everybody might have a smartphone, but not necessarily know how to, you know, kind of like leverage that smartphone to getting at the information, or even to like accessing their bank online. I mean, the bricks and mortar physical spaces are really so necessary in our communities. You know, our small business owners located on the same corridor that moved their banks from, moved their accounts from other places 12 years ago. And Senator Sanders, Amalgamated, is a part of the banking development district in the community where we work. So are regulated by the Department of Financial Services, and got deposits and subsidies, and, you know, advocated and lobbied the community to, you know, we want to come in, we want to serve, you know, a socially responsible bank, you know, as Amalgamated proclaims itself to be. And at the same time, at the height of this crisis, when they were needed the most, they're like, we're out. So, you know, there definitely is a disconnect between what the, you know, how banks are able to benefit and kind of like extract from communities when they want to, and then how they can just up and leave with, you know, there was like very little notification to the community, which is why we were so galvanized in looking at, you know, what are the ways to like really advocate for inclusive growth in the neighborhood. And then how can you have inclusive growth if they're not places where small businesses and community members and seniors and young people can access that, those tools to you know, to put their monies that they're earning. So I think that there's definitely a disconnect there that needs to be bridged.
Well, I agree with you, and I encourage you, Ms. McLean, to get in touch with my committee. Amalgamated, the Labor Bank, I mean, really, there are some questions that they need to answer. On the negative side in this whole period, the dismal introduction of the PPP has, the first rollout was utter disaster for communities of color and the MWBE community. The second rollout was poor to, I would rate it poor. And compared to the first part, it was fantastic. But all in all, in terms of helping the communities, it was poor. I'm looking at, on the positive side of this, I am looking at several banks have come up with incredible sums of money, at least what they announce, and say that they want to do, not just simply banks, corporations also have come up and said that they're going to do amazing things. Now, I have sat down with some of the largest corporations that are saying this, and I find that most of those are bogus. These are, I would call it a cheap hoax, but it's not. Expensive hoax being perpetrated against these communities. One or two may have something to it, and we'll see at the end of this one. It's been an interesting time. We can't hear you, Jamie.
Sorry, yeah, I'm looking at it. We got some questions from the audience, so I'm going to start doing those. I appreciate that, and we're actually really eager to talk with you more around the BDD. That's the second one that I know of in the city that is closed and has not been replaced. So it's definitely, I'm glad you're looking at that. So I believe I'm going to ask Elizabeth Alvarez's question. While there isn't formal banking institutions, there are culture-specific informal mechanisms of finance, like peer-to-peer lending and savings associations. How do we do more to engage and leverage those practices? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm playing with an idea of some of this peer-to-peer lending and some of these ideas of how do we incorporate it in the new structure of the public bank that I'm trying to create. So, and not simply the peer-to-peer as we know it. There's informal banking mechanisms that these communities have been using for years, and we're playing with that. And in the days to come, as we roll this out, I would speak more on it. So I'm listening to what people are saying and trying to figure out how do we make it in a modern banking system.
Yeah, I know I've seen some from like the Mission Asset Fund. Carrie, do you have any?
Yeah,
Also, that's great.
I was going to say something related to that. We conducted a survey of community members in one of our communities here in the South Bronx and another one in the Northeast Bronx, very high immigrant communities. And we asked about financial access and how people were able to access formal or quote unquote informal financial services. And we found that, like 13 to 14% of folks who responded were indeed participating in susu and tandas and partner and, just other ways in which, again, we have a dearth of banks in our communities. And so people are leveraging their culturally, known ways of like saving together and using that as like, I'm saving for a down payment to buy my house because they weren't able to get a mortgage from a bank to buy their house. And you know what? It's a 0% loan, essentially, and it's their money. So I think Mission Asset Fund recently has kind of been proliferating their methodology kind of like nationwide. So I think that there's opportunity here in New York City to leverage that. I know that there was like a launch event here in New York City. So we'd certainly be interested in tapping into that more.
No sound, Jamie.
Hey, trying to keep myself on mute. I think we have time for just one more. But I do encourage folks to stay, for those who can, afterwards, to keep the conversation going. So Jonathan Lane, can we unmute you? I think Guillermo's going to unmute. Yeah, okay. This is a UDF fellow.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So my name is Jonathan Lane. I'm with the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And I think one of the things that has been discussed since the onset of the pandemic is the idea of employee ownership, right? There was the Democracy Collaborative, the Marjorie Kelly proposal around kind of Marjorie Kelly et al. Thinking about using municipal liquidity funds from the Fed. Their, Working World and Mosaic Capital have been for a good long while. And obviously that represents an incredible opportunity to combat what I think it was Paulina was talking about in terms of this incredible wealth transfer, the likes of which we have rarely seen in, helping business owners instead of selling to, for instance, private equity firms. It's an opportunity to sell to their workers, which could accomplish the goals of increasing worker voice, providing profit participation for small businesses, and actually being able to create some real economic mobility and wealth building opportunities for Black and brown communities. So I'm curious, this is one of the topics of the Urban Design Forum Forefront Fellowship right now is around employee ownership. Curious to hear your take on what the role of city governments could look like in terms of fostering employee ownership at scale at a time when capital is not something that most cities have, quite the opposite. And when policy levers, largely, they exist already to facilitate these kinds of things, really interested in what role the city could or should play in facilitating employee ownership at scale?
Jonathan, this is a great question and one we've been batting around here in California. A couple of thoughts that we've been thinking about. You know, we're already seeing, like, you know, distressed commercial real estate, right? Like, you know, and so we've been working as a, you know, learning from the foreclosure crisis where, you know, private equity swooped in, Wall Street swooped in. So, you know, we've passed a law here in California around homes and multifamily units, and could nonprofits and community land trusts go in and have a first purchase of those, you know, as banks, you know, take them over potentially if there's foreclosures. Could we do that in the commercial space? And so could we have a first look right of purchase for land trusts and nonprofits, and then have small businesses actually own them? And then, you know, could you do something like that for then employee ownership, you know? So that could that facilitate that? So that's something we're thinking about. And then on the revenue side, because you need money then, right? To be able to then have the, you know, revenue to purchase the properties, and then the employee ownership fees. You know, we're looking at a corporate landlord tax. You know, could you tax corporate, I think maybe I said this, I can't remember. If you own more than one property, more than two properties, could you tax corporate landlords? That's one thing. And then the other is a public bank, you know, could issue bonds at a much lower rate to cities to do the stuff that you're talking about, or as I mentioned earlier, the cancel Wall Street. Like, you know, that's a, you know, might be longer term. So we do have to think of revenue generation in the short term. But I think we need to get those properties and somehow off the market for private equity and Wall Street, and that's like step number one. So just some quick thoughts on that.
If I may, Mr. Lane, I humbly differ with you in terms of the cities have no capital. I see the opposite. I see cities have enormous capital. I'm former chair of economic development at the city council. New York City's budget is roughly $90 billion before COVID, somewhere in there. If just 10% of that were put into a public bank, that's roughly $9 billion right there. That would be the largest boost that anybody's, I mean, that's a federal size boost. In fact, that's better than what the federal government has done to combat most of the social ills. And if you target those monies to go into worker-owned and to buy down the student debt and other social needs, you could do some amazing things. No, the opposite is true. We have enormous capital that we are insisting that Wall Street benefit from rather than the people.
Senator, can we get you to come to California too?
If it gets cold out here, I assure you it won't be that hard.
Kerry, do you want to get a last comment in?
Wonderful question, John. I think that's something that we're all thinking about. So WHEDco partners with the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, BCDI, and they're advancing some really interesting models of economic democracy, which includes cooperatives and, you know, how to leverage, you know, business-to-business activities here in the Bronx. So we're shopping locally on our corridors, but we're also procuring and contracting with small businesses in our neighborhoods and hiring locally and all of that. And I think that, you know, any initiative that has to do with cooperatives, of course, needs that financing. So the challenge, I think it goes back to access to capital, and that's definitely something that is one of the community finance challenges that we have here. And so really funding that, I know the state has a CDFI fund that needs to be maximized in terms of like all the dollars that are there to go to small businesses that typically are not able to access funding at like your traditional financial institution like a bank, as well as one of Jamie's favorite topics, EQ2s, and enabling nonprofits who are able to provide financing to have their balance sheets be such that it's a longer term you know, proposition on their balance sheet versus something that kind of like makes things go sideways. So I think the issue of banks, traditional financing, as well as the other ways in which small businesses can access financing, especially at this critical time, that those vehicles that we already have in existence, like the CDFI fund, and like EQ2s that banks can invest in. For example, you know, one of the things that we love is for Amalgamated or whoever. Sterling Bank is also, you know, leaving, you know, there's a branch in the Bronx that's going to be leaving. You know, JP Morgan Chase is there, but closed and expects to come back. Long story short is that there are ways that we can be encouraging very specifically these banks to reinvest in ways that will meet community members and small businesses where they are.
Thank you so much, everybody. I wish we could go on longer, but our time is up. So I just wanted to thank you all for your words of wisdom and for your time here. And I'm going to turn it over to Guillermo to give us the closing words. And
wow, what a terrific and exciting conversation. So many great ideas, so many questions that we'll pose in our power lunch that we're going to follow up now with. I'm just going to kind of close out today's proceedings with really my sincere thank you to Paulina, Senator Sanders, and Kerry for joining us this afternoon, and to Jamie for being such an incredible moderator today. If you packed a lunch and are ready for some debate and conversation after today's discussion, I invite you all to stick around this afternoon for our inaugural Power Lunch. Following today's event, we'll be hosting small breakout groups with attendees and ANHD and UDF staff. We've circulated a Zoom link in the chat if you'd like to hop on over shortly after today. I hope you all join us again in 2 weeks at our discussion on transportation equity with Betsy Plum of Riders Alliance in New York, Robbie McKinnon, the head of transit in Kansas City, and Warren Logan, who's overseeing transportation in Oakland's mayor's office. I want to thank the forum's board and director circle and ANHC's 10th annual conference supporters who helped make this afternoon possible. If you're interested in learning more about supporting our series, please be in touch with Lauren Nye at ANHD or Dan McPhee at the forum. And of course, please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #PowerAfterThePandemic. Stay safe and enjoy this beautiful fall weather, at least in New York City. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care, all.
All right, one down.